Hello everyone, welcome to our sixth session of the day 2. The topic for this session is the role of AI in today's connected world, presented by the very fantastic Mr. Peter Dorrington. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, and welcome to this presentation. In the next few slides, I'm going to share with you some of the work that I've been doing researching the way that people make decisions and how we can use those insights to serve them and organizations better. So for this presentation, I'm going to continue in the theme of AI, but with a specific focus on natural language understanding and about customers' emotions. So from customer emotions to actionable insights. Now, before I get into the content, I just want to share with you a few words about myself. So my name is Peter Dorrington, and I'm the founder of Exemplify Consulting. Now, I've been around for a little while. Most of my work has been in engineering, but the last 20 years or so has been specifically in data analytics and data science. Now, I'm very interested in the ways that we can use data science and combine it with behavioral science to understand why people do what they do, what they're going to do next, and what an organization can do that. Predominantly, that's been in the field of customer experience, but it is also equally applicable to employee experience. And more latterly, a lot of organizations have been looking at their entire value chain and ecosystem, and I call that partner experience. Now, that's enough about me. So before we begin, I'm going to ask you a quick question. No need to answer, but how are you feeling right now? So take a moment, and if some of you are thinking, well, I'm feeling warm or cold or a physiological sensation, that's fine. If you're feeling intrigued or bored or happy, that's also fine. But when we come to things like emotions, it's extremely difficult for us to analyze ourselves. And the reason for that is that our emotions live in our subconscious. And yet when we're asked a question like this, we have to consciously process it. So we try to take what's available in our subconscious, and most of us can't access that easily, bring it into our conscious mind, and then we quantify it and qualify it. And it's extraordinarily difficult to answer this kind of question. And yet, this is exactly the kind of question we need to be able to answer if we're going to serve the whole person and not just their specific logical or functional needs. Now, the reason I got interested in this was a recognition very early on in the world where I was working in the data science field that we couldn't explain everything with observations. In fact, a lot was not directly observable. And what I concluded, and this was from a lot of third-party research, is that feelings and emotions are an important part of how we interpret experience and how we decide what to do next. But they're not the whole story. And that's important because I'm going to come back to that. It's been a limiting factor on a number of research establishments looking at the use of AI to do this. It's not all or only feelings, important though they are. However, we do remember feelings. This quote from Maya Angelou has been quoted a lot. I'm not going to restate it here. You can use it yourself. But what I would say is you don't have to believe me. There's an enormous canon of work, particularly in the field of neuroscience, that shows that all human decisions have an emotional component. The strength of that component, though, is extremely variable. So it's not like saying that all decisions are always all emotional. And I'll explain how these things fit in a little while. But why should we, in the business community or as network operators or telcos, care about feelings? Isn't it enough that we run an efficient and effective organization and that we provide a high availability, low cost service? Well, when we take feelings and emotions into account about the way that people decide, we can better model what they're going to do. That's the part where I said, when I understand why people do what they do, I can then figure out what they're going to do next. And if I know what they're going to do next, I may be able to influence that to an optimal outcome. So I've run this with a lot of data, particularly in those retail sectors. So that's business to consumer, where we have mass populations and huge amounts of data. And here's what I found. Firstly, when you take emotions into account about the way that people do decide, and then you respond to that by making better offers or differentiating you from the competition, it increases revenue. And the increases can be very significant. 10, 20, sometimes 30% improvement in revenue directly from making a better decision. That doesn't mean it has to cost more. In fact, when you get it right and you're making an optimal decision, your costs can go down. And I'll explain about this in a moment. But also, people begin to think of you in a different way. And there's some research going to be coming out very shortly, which shows that the way that people feel about the experiences they have relate to an indirect measure like customer satisfaction, or something more direct like the way that their loyalty is expressed, or they take on more products. So they buy more from us because they're influenced by the way that they feel. And that customer satisfaction can directly relate in an increased longevity of their relationship with us. They stay customers for longer, but more importantly, they stay economically active during that period. So the customer lifetime value is improved. And these are things that we can directly measure and attribute to the effect of emotions. But as I said, not just emotions, and I'll explain the model that I use in a moment. So that's the big figures. By taking into account the human elements of decision making, such as emotions, we can be perceived as better than our competition. We can increase our revenue or decrease our costs. We can protect profit because we don't have to give away so much margin in order to try and secure business. And we can reduce churn. And then there's the holy grail of customer satisfaction, advocacy. People who feel good about the experiences they have, not just that they get a good experience, but they feel that they've had a good experience, are active advocates. They go on social media and they talk about the wonderful experience they've had, particularly about the way that they make them feel. Because at the end of the day, our human connections are informed and colored by our feelings. So where can we use this kind of technology? Well, it can impact every phase of a customer life cycle. When we understand what motivates people, it enables us to understand what people really care about, which is not always what they say they care about. And then we can find customers who care about the same things. So we can see that if we've identified that this particular aspect of our service or our product is important to people because of the way it affects their lives, then they will be able to find other customers, and we can help them make a purchasing decision. Particularly important right now in the outfallings of COVID-19. People are feeling anxious and uncertain. So one of the things we can do is recognize that that's the case and allay those feelings and help customers make decisions that they really should make, but they've been putting off, hoping to get some more certainty about what's going on in their lives. So that's acquiring. But when we onboard them, we can take that initial sales experience, that purchase experience, and make it richer by identifying those people who may need a little bit of help in activating, in starting to use the product or the service. We can show how we can appeal to their feelings in order to get them to perhaps do some of the things which are in their own interests by adopting certain behaviors. And of course, we can make recommendations which are more in tune with what is going to make them feel happy. And then during their life cycle, we can continue to engage with them. We can recognize that circumstances change, that people's outlook on life changes, a lot because of what has actually happened to them, but also because what's going on in the zeitgeist. The greater population is feeling things. So we can personalize next best actions on more than just a simple recommendation. We can look at a one-to-one recommendation that is appealing to the whole person. And that means we can be empathic. And that's an important part of what's going on in the world right now. A lot of people within the world of AI are looking at empathy. What does it mean to be an emotive business? And finally, I said we can reduce churn. Wouldn't it be great that if we understood what people care about and what this affects them, we could anticipate if they started to become at risk of churn before they became symptomatic? That is to say, before they started to shop around for an alternative. Because if we can do that, it's much easier and cheaper to retain those valuable customers than trying to win them back when they've already pretty much made up their mind that they're going to leave. But we can also subtly reward loyalty with things that may not cost a great deal, but mean a great deal to people. So we can use their behavior to give them a psychological reward, which gives them a greater sense of comfort and security. And that, of course, means that they will continue to be active. So rather than they begin to fall out of use or they begin to lapse, we can give them subtle reminders of the value that they're getting from a relationship. So this is a way of putting both the customer and relationship back into customer relationship management, which all too often is about management. So I said that there's a whole series of things that go on when people are deciding about how to evaluate an experience or whether they're going to purchase. And I'm going to share with you some of my unpublished research about what motivates customers. So this can be applied in a business-to-business context, but it's slightly more complicated. So let me first start with what you can see on the left of this screen. We've got a 4-box model. On one axis, we've got motivation, and I'm going to split these into 2 camps. There are psychological, emotional, behavioral motivations, and then there are rational and functional motivations. But the other axis is how do we decide? So at the top, we have the internal factors, the things that we either want in order to service a particular need or we need a solution to demonstrate. And then there are the external criteria about how do I choose whom to purchase from. So you can see that there are some examples here. So under rational, we've got things like the removal of pain, always the biggest one. People will pay a lot to make pain go away, but suitability and durability. The psychological ones are things like behavioral economics or habit or self-esteem, maybe religious observance or the way that we emulate what's going on, or societal conformance. In the external factors, things like convenience may be important or price, whereas when we're looking at external factors, it may be, well, am I even aware that you exist? So how does this work in practice? Well, let me give you a very simple example on the right-hand side. So looking at this diagram, we've got a screen for the vendor, that's us, and a screen for the customers. So let me start with the top right with the customer. The customer identifies that they have a need. Now, they may identify they have a need because marketing has told them that they have one. But once they've decided that they need something, they start to think about how they're going to satisfy that need. So the first case is going to be rational. Does your product or service suitably meet the needs? So is it fit for purpose? Now that is a relationship between features. And again, one of the things we have to do is inform a customer about how our features meet their needs. So I'm not going to use the word benefit here because that has a very specific meaning in the world of finance, but it definitely is the way we express things. But I'm thinking about this as a customer-centric way. What is it that they're looking for that they need and they decide is suitable? The next criteria for this particular customer would be convenience. Perhaps they don't have access to transport or they live in a remote area. So convenience for them may mean several different things for a vendor. And if it's a retail store, it might mean proximity. How close physically is my store to my customers? It may also mean capacity. So do I have enough capacity that I can deal with demand? And for a retail store, that may be the number of tills that I have or the number of people that are on the tills. And then availability. So is it both convenient in terms of geography, but also are the hours of operation convenient? Perhaps this is a customer that works during the day and can only get to a retailer in the evening. So the customer may roll all this up under the banner of convenience, but for us, the vendor, that may mean several different things. The final facet I'll use in this particular customer is that they're very cost conscious. So economy is important to them. They don't have a huge amount of money. They may love your product, but if they can't afford it, they simply won't be able to purchase it. Now, economy is always going to be a tension between the vendor and the customer. As vendors, the first things we have to do is cover our costs. If we cannot make a profit if we're not covering our costs. And we'd always like to have the largest margin that we can, so we would like to charge the highest price that the market would bear, or in this case, that the customer can afford. But let's assume that we meet all of those criteria. So we're suitable to meet the customer's needs. We're sufficiently convenient that they don't have to go out of their way to purchase our product, and we're affordable to them. All of those things being equal, and as long as we're in a good position, that should lead to a purchase. And following the purchase, the use of the product or service then relates to satisfaction. And I've put a dotted line between satisfaction and profit. They're not directly linked, but they are indirectly linked. And to give you an example of how that works, high customer satisfaction can be linked to longer term loyalty and more economic activity, both of which we can measure in monetary terms. So the business has an equation that runs along the lines of cost and price. And the consumer has a whole series of other considerations that they're thinking about. And not all of the things in the table on the left are, of course, active all of the time. But these are the primary motivators that we should be thinking about as we design a service or a product for our customers. Now, I take that and then I try to work out how could I build a computer model that could predict what an individual customer is going to do next. And this is the model that I had to come up with, because it wasn't just using natural language understanding to identify what customers talk about and how frequently and how much weight they apply to things, or about the observations of transactional data, like when was the last time they purchased and how much did they spend. So let me talk you very quickly through this. The first two items are on the horizontal axes. So I talked about need, rational, functional needs, things like price and availability and convenience. These are the things we tend to consciously think about and are also bounded. And by bounded, what I mean is that they can be satisfied. So if I am hungry and I eat, I then satisfy my hunger and it goes away. Now, of course, there's an irrational side to that. I may enjoy eating what I'm eating so much that I overeat, and that's an irrational behavior, in which case we should consider that as a want. So wants tend to be emotional and behavioral, and they're unbounded. So it doesn't matter how happy I am, I always believe I could be a little bit happier. It doesn't matter how calm I feel, I always believe I could be a little bit more calm. So there's always a blend of these two things, what I need, the rational side of my demand, and what I want, which is the emotional side. So we have to work out for each customer and each interaction to balance those two things, but they don't exist in a vacuum. So when we're faced with a decision which we either think is too complicated or too difficult or too energy consuming, we often look to other people. And this is sometimes called the wisdom of crowds. And it's why star ratings and recommendations are so important, because we tend to want to follow the herd. And I'm sure all of us have done a search on an online store where we've filtered by 4 or 5 out of 5 star ratings in the assumption that that means that that product is particularly good compared to other products. Now, there is, of course, a downside to this. New products don't have a star rating, so they often don't get to that position. So it can be difficult to enter a market dominated by external influences. But we also have that internal narrative, our internal bias. Now, these fall into 2 separate camps. The first of which is cognitive bias. We think that we're rational, logical beings, but we know of at least 150 ways in which our internal logic lets us down. And an example of that is if you've ever left the house and come back with two purchases of items you'd never intended to buy one of when you left. And it could well be that you thought you've got a real bargain, that there's some explicit value in that, and that you had to act quickly. Now, of course, retailers are well aware of these kind of biases and they use them. So they know that our logic isn't always logical, but there's another type of bias, and it's the ones we don't think about, and hence it's called unconscious bias. And this is where we use stereotypes or prejudices, and we just assume that we can extrapolate one or two data points to a whole population. So for example, I might be unconsciously biased to buying German cars because I tend to think that they're better engineered. I may have no empirical evidence that that's the case, nonetheless, I believe it. So we also have those external influences and our internal biases to contend with. And then there are two really big ones. The first of which is the stimulus and the context. What is it that I'm trying to do, where and how? And we have to know this. The use case that's existent in this time, the history that goes with that data. And in one of the presentations, Dr. Patna talked about, smart data, data that has some context to it. But I mentioned history, and this is one of the most powerful influences. Our own personal experiences shape the way that we both anticipate what we think is going to happen. That is, we set a level of expectation against which we will measure an experience, and also how we evaluate an experience. And it's true that in customer experience, we don't evaluate an experience in a vacuum. We compare the experiences we have not just with the best in that particular sector or industry, but with the best experiences we've ever had anywhere. And we've used expectation and our history to then think about, well, what would I expect to happen next? And that's the bar that we as vendors have to be able to meet. So I'm now going to get into some of the natural language understanding, and particularly about emotional understanding. There's an enormous amount of research going on in this field. My research is based upon empirical evidence, and I'm not going to make any claims for my expertise in neuroscience, other than to say it works. So the first thing to talk about are emotions, arousal, valence, and dominance. That's quite a mouthful, but I'm going to start with a diagram that's used all around the world. It's very familiar to a lot of people, and it's the Wheel of Emotions by Robert Plutchik. Now, why did I alight upon this? Well, there are a few things that I took away from Robert's work. The first of which is that he identified 8 core emotions which are universal. Everybody on the planet feels these 8 emotions. And whilst we could have a debate about whether there are 8 or 10 or 5 or 300, this tends to be a model that works well enough. So the second thing that came out of Plutchik's work was that these 8 emotions, like joy and trust, have opposites. So the opposite of joy is sadness. Now, that doesn't mean to say you can't feel them both at the same time, but they are never synonymous with each other. Also, that they have degree, and that's arousal. Now, in Plutchik's model, higher arousal, which equates to energy, is at the center of the diagram, and lower arousal, which is low energy, tends to be at the circumference of the diagram. A couple of other things to add out of here, which meant that this was easily translatable into a computer model. Firstly, I use these as an array, so I don't care about their physical adjacentness or not. But joy and trust combined is what Plutchik used to describe love. And trust with fear is submission. I know you're going to do it. I don't like it. I'm afraid for it, but I'm actually going to submit. So you have dyads and combinations. So you can express almost any other emotion by degrees of the mixture of these. So please bear that in mind, because I'm going to come back to it in a moment. Before I do, there's another diagram I'd like to share with you. And this is the circumplex diagram by James Russell. Now, I've simplified this a little bit because I would like you to imagine that all of these 8 emotions that Robert Plutchik's using exist on the diagram on the right. So what is this diagram? Well, firstly, there's a horizontal axis, which is the valence, that is the pleasantness of an emotion. So on the extreme right, we have got positive valence. It feels good. And on the extreme left, we have negative valence. It feels unpleasant. The vertical axis is the energy level. So at the bottom, we've got low arousal, and at the top, we have high arousal, high energy. And all of our emotions move around in these diagrams all of the time. And it's always a blend of emotions. We don't just feel one thing at a time. So in this case, I've got joy, which is in this particular example, medium energy, pleasant experience. Calmness is low energy, but still pleasant, whereas sadness can be low energy, but unpleasant. And indeed, people who are depressed have very low energy, but very deep sadness. But I'd like you to look at what's happening with anger. It starts with a relatively mild sense of annoyance. And as long as the stimulus exists, it will grow to go from annoyed to angry. And if the stimulus still exists and is unresolved, anger goes on to become rage. Now, this is a way, if you imagine this was a radar plot and these emotions are moving around and we could track all of those, how powerful would that be for an organization to be able to have a plot like this for every single customer in their customer database? And the simple fact is you can, if you take into account things like history and the way that you score that. Dominance I've not shown on this, but it is the precedence order of certain emotions. Fear, for example, is often dominant over anger because it's a survival trait. If I'm afraid, I should run away rather than stand and get angry at the tiger. So dominance may come into play, but for most of the cases where I work with businesses about this, it isn't actually that significant. The other thing I'd like you to think about is that the levels of our emotions don't stay static, and the way that we feel about things is affected by time. And I've deliberately chosen a truck for this because I looked hard at the truck ownership over time. So pre-purchase, we're using the motivation model. We're trying to figure out what is it that the customer wants, or the customer's trying to figure out, what do I want from a truck? They go to a dealership and they buy their new car, their new truck, and it's got that new car feeling. It smells great, the leather is supple, the engine's driving with no noise. I love it. So for a long time, you're going to feel as if it's a new car. But as time passes, it stops feeling new, but now it's your car. So this is my car now. Yes, it's not new, but I'm comfortable with it. But as time goes on, even my car starts to fall away. Now we just start to think about it. Well, it's just a way of getting around. It's a car. Keep it long enough and it becomes an old car. Keep it even longer, it becomes a wreck. Now, all the time, the way that we feel attachment to this vehicle continues to degrade until we start to come out of the other side, a wreck. And then something interesting happens. My wreck, if I keep it long enough, starts to become a classic. And if I keep it even longer, it becomes a vintage collectible car. And what I've seen is, particularly in America with the experience with trucks, is a lot of truck ownership is actually between old car and wreck. But once they reach about 35, 40 years old, they start to become classics and people will drive them around and they like them rusty. They like to show that that car's got a bit of age to it. So if imagine you're an auto manufacturer at this point. Obviously we're trying to sell new cars, but we know that most of our profit actually comes aftermarket in things like servicing and parts. So the way that people feel about their car can affect the way that they purchase parts. So for a car or an old car, maybe we'll go for an off-brand aftermarket part because I don't really care, that car's not very valuable. But once they start to become classic and vintage, we actually want to go back to original parts. And so we can charge more for those. So that's the theory. There are core emotions which all of us feel all of the time, but to varying degrees. There are ways that we can plot those along with the energy levels and which emotions are in the driving seat of a decision or not at any given time, and time is a factor. So how do I use these to develop a computer model? Well, the first thing I have to do is figure out how I'm going to store emotion. what does it look like in terms of an array or in a record? So first of which, it has to be associated with an individual. So we will have one of these signatures for every person that we're thinking of. And then we need to capture what emotions is this person feeling about the subject. So, the subject is, I am feeling angry about the length of queues, or I am feeling happy about the great delivery service I received. So there's a subject, and then there are aspects of that subject. What is it about the delivery service that I particularly like? And which emotions, plural, because they're rarely just one, am I feeling, and to what degree of intensity? So that's the what part. Then there's a where part, because that context is important. If my car breaks down in the middle of the day, 100 meters from my house, I will feel differently about that than if it breaks down at 2 o'clock in the morning, 20 miles away from anywhere where I can get help, and it's a dark and stormy night. So context clearly has an effect on the way that I feel, as does time. I mentioned the longitudinal element of this, but it isn't just periods measured in months or years. It can be measured in hours or days. For example, if I'm surprised, surprise is not a long-term persistent emotion. It comes and goes very quickly. Whereas anger may take longer to dissipate. And if I'm stimulated again, my anger will continue to grow. So we need to know, when did it start? When did I start to feel that emotion? Because there may be a difference between the stimulus and the response. And how long does it typically take to go back to our comfort zone, which is medium energy, medium valence? And of course, in order that I understand why this all happens, I need to capture a cause. If we do this, we have a record that we can use to describe what this person cares about and why they care about it. Now, I'm going to talk in a couple of slides about how we use this. And there are two very distinct phases. So the first phase is the research phase. And this is where we often go wrong when we're trying to build models of human behavior. We try to do it all as a one-stop shop, and it doesn't work that way, and I'll explain why. But firstly, I'm going to start with customer records. Now, the customer record itself has two parts, irrespective of where we got it from. There's a narrative, the story, the language that I'm going to analyze, but there's also some quantitative data that goes around that, which includes some metadata. I'm going to park the quantitative data for just 1 second and talk about natural language processing and natural language understanding. Things that are typically done by good tools in this area are topic modeling. That is, what is this narrative about? And sometimes we see those expressed as word clouds. These words or phrases keep being repeated in, for example, a voice of the customer program. And sentiment analysis. Now, sentiment is that positive, negative, or neutral evaluation of a statement. I'm cautious about sentiment. It is not as predictive as we would like. But some tools go further. Some of these natural language processing or understanding tools will tell you what the emotion of the narrator was at the time that that statement was made. Now, the very best tools will give you simultaneous reads on multiple emotions, and they will say, in this statement, there is this degree of anger, this degree of joy, this degree of surprise, whatever those may be for that particular tool. So the topic modeling helps us to develop our ontology and our taxonomy, because there are contexts within which certain words and phrases have a particular meaning. But what I was interested in was then bringing those along with the outcome. So what happened from this person who was making this statement? And that's the behavioral point. And what I want to drive from that are two things. I want to identify the moments that matter, or the event or the occasion that matters to this person. And also, I'd like to be able to put them into certain emotional personae. That is, this is somebody who is dominated by these feelings as opposed to somebody who is dominated by those feelings. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, because this is unlike the attribute personae that we often use for things like marketing and segmentation. When I do the behavioral analytics, there are several different modeling techniques I can use. So I can build correlation models. People who are angry tend to do this. As I found in one example, people who are feeling shame for whatever reason will often find some way of leaving that situation. Either they cancel an account or they don't turn up for an appointment. We can start to build explanatory models. So we can go back over what happened and begin to put an explanation, which is behavioral. So we can see that certain people left because we generated feelings which are very negative, and that person was then stimulated to do something about it. But if we can do explanatory models, it's not a long step to start to go to predictive ones. So we can say, well, if we do this and we do this, and we know that these are both negative, we can predict that will have a negative outcome in terms of business. And I've seen this in, as I gave in earlier examples, people who buy more or stay more loyal or churn or some other factor that we're very interested in. And those go into our model factory. So now we're going to have a series of models based upon behavior and quantitative data. Bear in mind my model before, there's rational and functional, there's quantitative and qualitative. So that's phase one. The thing that I would like to point out here is that unlike many other researchers, I didn't try to come up with a perfect model of the human being. That's incredibly difficult to do, and context is everything. But what I could come up with was those moments that matter. I could model the event, I could model the entity rather than the person. And that's important when we come to the second phase, the operational phase. So now I'm watching for those events. So I'm getting customer records coming through. I know who this customer is, and I look at the quantitative event data. Has one of those models, moments that matter, happened? And if it has, which type of persona do I think this customer is currently exhibiting? And then I can use the appropriate model to score their behavior. And what I'm doing is, rather than coming up with one big regression model for every single customer, which needs enormous compute power if you have hundreds of thousands or millions of customers, I'm doing an adjustment on an existing score. So I assume everybody starts from the same place, but over time, the events that they are exposed to are different, and they begin to develop different scores. Their emotional signature becomes divergent. So what I'm actually doing is calculating the delta between how that customer felt yesterday and how I think they feel today as a result of what's happened. And that goes back to that customer signature or customer emotions table. And it's that we use to inform our decision-making models. And that can be anything from real time, enabled to pluck a better action as a result of how I think a customer's feeling right now, or I can use it as a completely preemptive model to say, I'm going to go and find customers I haven't even spoken to, but I think may be feeling a particular way, either more receptive or less so. Perhaps I need to heal that kind of relationship. And it's here that you get the really big benefits as an organization. Now, here's the caveat. No model I've ever come across is 100% accurate at predicting human behavior, particularly if you're not talking to them in the moment. And mine is just the same. However, it is much better than when you don't use this data. In fact, emotional data is second only to comprehensive attribute data in predicting what people will do next. It's far more predictive than text analytics and far, far more predictive than sentiment analysis when used at the individual customer level. So that delta, that improvement, is reflected in things like how effective your marketing campaigns are, or the way in which your customer service is being delivered. Now, I mentioned customers a lot in this presentation, but employees are important too. And here's the reason. When you're looking to affect a major change in business, there are common mistakes that most businesses make. So I'm going to walk you through these 4 steps. So step 1 is to set direction. In my experience, most businesses are very good at developing a vision, making it feel real, and coming up with strategy. However, because most businesses set themselves up and believe themselves to be logical, functional, operationally efficient businesses, far too many of them immediately jump to step 3, which is Let's figure out what capabilities we need. Let's get some plans in place. Who's going to do what? As if people are machines and they will simply do what they are told. In my experience, and this was captured very well, and I first came across it in this book, Drivers, from an old colleague of mine, you have to appeal to people not just in their logic, but their emotions. So employees need to have a sense that this is believable. Yes, we can achieve that. I believe in the vision. I believe in the strategy, and belief is entirely emotional. It also has to be something that they want. They need to desire it. Why would I want this change? Now, if you don't do this, what you'll see in an organization, particularly amongst the experienced employees, is there will be a cadre of the passive aggressives, the people who will simply sit back and say, well, this is just another strategy du jour. If I wait around, the board will come up with a new one next year. Why should I change? So you have to appeal to your workforce at an emotional as well as rational level by making it believable and desirable. The second factor is also one that's often overlooked, and it's been exasperated by the sprint culture. And that is, we sprint to a finish line of a project and then go, phew, thank goodness that's over. Let's get on to the next sprint, without taking the time or expending the energy to sustain the change that you've just made. And this is exhibited when organizations start to fall back to behaviors that are tried and trusted and comfortable. So people will say, yes, I'm for the change. We make the change. We've got a new system, and they go back to doing things the old way because it feels most comfortable to them. So in order to make a change last and a change stick, you have to maintain energy and you have to stay visible. You have to keep reminding people that the change is good and has a positive effect for both the business and for them. So employees are every bit as emotional as customers. And when the two intersect, you can have a really powerful mix of employees who are highly motivated to do well for the customers and customers who are highly motivated to stay with an organization which is appealing to their sense of worth and well-being and is adding so much more than just a good product at a good price. So in summary then, feelings are an important part of how we interpret experience. If I expect good and I get bad, that's twice as bad from an experiential point of view than if I had no expectation at all. And if your marketing overstates what you're going to deliver, you are going to set yourself up for very low satisfaction scores. On the other hand, if your marketing underpromises what you can deliver, it's hard to justify an appropriate price. So it's important that we get this right. The second thing is that when you deploy it efficiently, emotion analytics does deliver real-term, measurable, quantifiable business results, things that the CFO can put onto a balance sheet and measure. And that's a big win in the world of qualitative analysis and behavior. But there are lots of factors that contribute to the way that people think about and decide what is for them a good experience or not. Now, I would recommend start with a small number of emotions and keep them relatively crude. Do not try to get into very nuanced discussions. The reason for that is they're extremely hard to explain to other people. Whereas if I go to an experiential designer and say, I think this customer experience is dominated by anger, that designer understands what anger is, particularly if I tell them what they're angry about, and can therefore come up with a solution that will address that. We can get into graduation and shades later on. And it's also important about how strongly we feel about something. You know, very angry is clearly less desirable than mildly annoyed. So, and it's a virtuous or an irascible circle. It can either spiral down into negativity or we can use it to climb to the heights. Now, if we're going to do analysis, we need to know more than just a feeling and when or how much. And by the way, if you want to know how somebody is feeling, like I did at the beginning of this survey, this presentation, don't ask people how they feel. Nobody knows how to answer that question accurately. When you deploy, it has two phases, and the first phase can be very quick and give you immediate strategic results. That's research. Just by doing a little bit of research, you will identify what customers care about, why they care about it, and how strongly it influences what they do. We can get into degrees of how we continue to rescore every night and how frequent at a later date. But the first research phase gives you immediate results and can be concluded very quickly. And I'd like to just remind you that your employees are people too. And they have feelings and they have emotions, and whether they want to or not, that is dictating their behavior and the way that they respond. So all that remains for me to do is to thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found this presentation interesting. I invite you to reach out and make contact. So either email me directly at peter@exemplify.co.uk, or please extend me an invitation on LinkedIn, and my address is up at the top right, or follow me on Twitter at @pdorrington. And with that, all I can say is thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you very much for the nice presentation. For the first time, honestly, I didn't want to end it. It's really beautiful. I have a question for you.
Of course.
Do you think for employers, it is very important to also associate responsibilities with behavior, and how that is going to affect the organization itself and the productivity as well?
Oh, that is a very good question. And I have strong feelings about this myself. So when we're affecting change and cultural change, all too often I see corporate dissonance where the people at the top say one thing and do another. They say that we want to be customer centric and that we want to exhibit these behaviors where we put customers at the center of what we do, but they reward people who often do things which are counter to that. They're not in the customer's best interest, but they're in their employees' or employers' best interest. So as you affect decision, you must firstly exhibit the behaviors yourself. So live the values rather than just put them on the wall. And secondly, reward those employees, and especially managers who have the greatest degree of influence over their line reports, also for exhibiting those behaviors. So it's not just how you do it in terms of your process or your mechanisms, but the way in which you've lived those values. And you can see the organizations that don't. Those organizations that say one thing, that we're going to be next, we're there for you as a company, we're going to take care of you, and then they do something which is blatantly in their self-interest. That comes across. As human beings, we pick up on it very quickly. We know when we're being lied to. We know that when somebody's trying to pull the wool over our eyes. So it is difficult for many organizations. That's not the way they've set up their internal measures. Most of their measures come from an industrial era, and it's about productivity and mechanism and repeatability, as if there's one perfect way to do everything. But as you and I know, Dr. Fatima, when we're dealing with people, there's no one perfect answer. Everybody is slightly different, and it's being able to accommodate those changes which is so important. So yes, absolutely, employers do have to firstly exhibit the behaviors that they demand of their employees. And secondly, they have to develop ways in which they reward and motivate their employees to do that. And I guess one third item is their fiduciary responsibility goes beyond simply growing the business. Although that is super important for the shareholders, there are different ways of doing that. And perhaps we should extend fiduciary responsibility to say, we need to create value for our customers, for our employees, as well as our shareholders and other stakeholders. So sorry, long answer to a very succinct question. I do apologize.
No, it's a very interesting answer. Maybe I would like to ask another question when it comes to AI modeling. How do you think that would fit within the model? And is there an existing model that you can suggest right away?
So I use one specific case of machine learning and then AI. So natural language understanding, natural language processing clearly has a role to play. In order to accurately model those moments that matter, I need multiple exemplars. So I need lots and lots of examples to teach a model. Otherwise, I just end up with a lot of randomness that's in there. So I use AI and machine learning to firstly parse all of the language. What is this person talking about? What is their emotional state? And as a byproduct, I tend to get things like sentiment as well. The second thing I do is to use it to rescore and retune the models, because no model is perfect, particularly as you start off earlier. So we need to keep adjusting on the thing, the effect of the closed loop. I thought this was what was important to this customer. I took this action, but I didn't get the response that either they or we anticipated. So I need to go back and retune. And the fastest way to do that is with AI. There is one other thing, perhaps I'm letting too much out here, but the scoring of those behaviors over time, that emotional signature that follows every single customer, that doesn't need to be AI. In fact, it can be very simple if you have the sophistication in the models about how you're evaluating the events. The reason it can be simple is because I'm looking at small changes, but over a long time, rather than trying to say, do a regression on try and understand everything about your personal history all in one go. When you do that, you end up with a system that can run a computation and rescore every single customer's by the tens of millions every 24 hours. Now, that can then be adjusted for real time when you are in a conversation, but it does have a couple of important attributes. When you're doing that in a multicultural, multinational environment, there are, of course, subtle changes between different groups, different nationalities, different cultures, and AI can help pick out what those are so that human beings can help explore and interpret those. But also the language. When I model the event, I'm not so troubled by things like slang or specific terms or people being sarcastic, because I can take the inputs of 1,000 people about an event rather than rely on just one. So AI to interpret the language, to help build and retune the models, not necessarily for scoring, but then the other thing is, what do you do with those scores? And the best examples I've seen is when you take a score like that and fill it into real-time customer service or real-time marketing, where AI is evaluating multiple scenarios about next best action and is running optimizations to make sure that you're spreading your investment in the most efficacious way possible. So lots and lots of space for AI in here, and we're only just scratching the surface.
Beautifully answered. Thank you very much. You mentioned something related to crowd management when it comes to culture and emotions. Would you a little bit explain how that would fit within the model? I myself am supervising one of my students on such a thing, so I would like to hear from you so we can learn.
Okay, I will try and cover this to my best of my ability. So I talked about the core emotions, and there are obviously dominant drivers in human behaviors. If we looked at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for example, he broke it down into 5 very distinct layers. My own model of motivations is very similar. I didn't show it in that table, but there is a hierarchy of motivations. So when we understand the motivations and the context, now the context is in the real-time moment, but the history is the period leading up to that, we can begin to identify that those emotional personae, those segments, are going to start to respond to a given stimulus in a particular way. So, and this is an example, I think, where AI, the temptation is to become overly sophisticated. So I don't know how many people are aware of the work that was being done to try and model the flocking behavior of birds. I was interested in this for fire evacuation. We were trying to figure out, how do people evacuate the building when a fire alarm goes off? And for a long time, flocking algorithms just got more and more complex, but really didn't replicate the kinds of things we see in real life. But actually what turned out to work was a much simpler model. So the flocking algorithm got good when we identified there are actually only 3 or 4 basic rules that determine how an entire flock works. So it's maintain speed, maintain distance from the birds around you, follow my leader. And once you've distilled out the core essence of that behavior, you could build a very simple model which allowed us to reproduce in virtual reality a flocking behavior. Now, crowd behavior and cultural behavior is very similar. I mentioned the wisdom of the crowds. We tend to want to follow herd. We're a social animal. And the important thing about experiences is how we share them. And we share them at an emotional level. We never describe something without emotional content. So we will use those adjectives to describe it. And again, once you understand those, you can take the entity of person and extrapolate that into the context of crowd or culture or region or language. There are certain differences, but the big advantage of the core emotions is that everybody on the planet roughly exhibits and feels anger in the same way. So different analogy, if I put my hand into a fire, it doesn't matter whether I swear in English or Arabic, it still hurts. Emotions are very much like that. The core emotions are universal. They're the core of what we are as a person and what we are as a society. When you know those things, you can start to build them into the models. Particularly, I think in the case of crowds, I would look very carefully at the role of dominance, which emotions are dominant in that particular situation. I'm afraid,
Thank you very much. Thank you.
No,
Thank you so much. We will continue about this discussion. It's really interesting, and unfortunately, we're running out of time, waiting for the next speaker. So it was such an interesting presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to speak. And can I just remind everybody, please find me on LinkedIn or reach out or send me an email. I always respond. I may not have the answer that you're looking for, but I will do my best.
Thank you.
So thank you and goodbye. Bye-bye now.